And so, ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to discuss, has the Electoral Commission led us to make the mark, the X, or the tick in that box? In simple terms, the role of the Electoral Commission in shaping our democratic governance. This afternoon, to help us to do this discussion, we have assembled 4 very eminent Ghanaians who have a wealth of experience dealing with Ghana's electoral process. I shall introduce the keynote speaker and permit me to introduce the others in turn by giving you a bit more detail about them. And so today, to lead the pack is no less a person than the former chairman of the Electoral Commission of Ghana. He has been described as a farmer, and as my colleague Alfred said, he will tell us a bit about farming and perhaps farming the electoral process. He was a Best District fish farmer in 2016. He has also been recognized at the 32nd National Farmers' Day celebration in the Greater Accra region, where he received this honor. He hails from Enyimon in the Brekum Municipal District in the Brong-Ahafo region. He has always loved farming, but then in his professional life served as chairman, leading presidential, parliamentary, district level elections. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the singular honor of presenting to you Dr. Kwadwo Afari-Gyan, who would present our keynote address. Later, I'll give you a bit more detail about our second panelist, Mr. Peter McMenu, campaign manager for the New Patriotic Party in the 2016 elections, and I think to his credit, also led his party to victory. We would have also on the panel, Madame Samia Nkrumah, who is the president of the Kwame Nkrumah Pan-African Center and at one point led the Convention People's Party. And we would also have no less a person than Mr. Samuel Ofosu Ampofo, the National Vice Chair and Director of Elections of the National Democratic Congress. So these are the people who will be listening to this afternoon. We shall commence with Dr. Afari-Gyan, and I'll go on to give you a bit more detail about our other speakers in due course. This program is being carried live thanks to the partnership that the organizers, the Institute of Law and Public Affairs, and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung enjoy with Media General. And so it is not only in the studio audience, but it's being carried across the world. And so we would also have participation not only from us here, but persons outside this room. After they have made their positions known to us, we shall have a peer review session where they would pose questions to each other, and then we will come to the audience, have our closing remarks, and then call it an evening. And so, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Dr. Afari-Gyan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, my colleagues on the elevated platform, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I wish to thank the Resident Director of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Ghana and the Committee of Fellows of the Institute of Law and Public Affairs for asking me to be part of this year's Accra Dialogue. As a former member of the Electoral Commission, I wish to start with a disclaimer. I speak for myself and not for any other member of the Commission, past or present. The moderator, I read in the topic for our dialogue, consolidating Ghana's democratic governance, the assumption, which I consider to be correct, that some progress has been made. So the issue is how to consolidate the gains and forge on towards democratic governance. I do not intend to offer a definition of democratic governance, except to say that I take it that the basic elements of Ghana's democratic governance are to be found in our constitution and other relevant laws, even though they may not thereby be cast in gold, and the parameters may therefore be subject to further refinement and expansion. Let me also say that I view democratic governance as an ideal to strive for, and the journey towards it as a long one, perhaps an unending one, as even advanced democracies continually seek improvement to their democratic infrastructure. Against the foregoing backdrop, in my view, stated in one sentence, the role of the Electoral Commission in consolidating Ghana's democratic governance is to institutionalize electoral democracy. That is, the ability of the Ghanaian people to genuinely and freely choose their leaders by their votes at democratic elections. I must say straight away that even though by law the Electoral Commission plays a leading role in establishing electoral democracy, it cannot do so all alone. It must, of necessity, build durable partnerships with relevant stakeholders. If my view is correct, our first concern should be whether, as an institution, the Electoral Commission is well equipped to play the lead role in consolidating electoral democracy. Mr. Moderator, for an election management body to be able to function well, it needs a sound legal framework and adequate operational capacity. How does the Electoral Commission of Ghana measure to this test? In terms of the legal framework, in doing its work, the Commission is insulated from the direction or control of any person or authority. The functions and powers of the Commission and the requirements for people to participate in electoral activities are clearly spelled out. There is security of tenure for the commissioners and technical staff alike against summary dismissal. The Commission has power to make subsidiary legislation in furtherance of this work. There are mechanisms for the resolution of election dispute, including access to the courts. The expenses of the Commission are charged on the consolidated fund, and the Commission hires its own workers in consultation with the Public Services Commission. In terms of operational capacity, the Commission has created a transparent framework for doing its work. It is able to plan its programs and activities in a detailed and coherent manner. It has well-trained officers who have the requisite professional skills to do their work, and the Commission makes appropriate use of technology in its work. In my view, then, the Electoral Commission has a sound legal framework as well as adequate operational capacity to function well. So we can say that in principle, it is well positioned to pursue the agenda of consolidating electoral democracy. Mr. Moderator, it is to be noted that the Electoral Commission is responsible for practically everything that has to do with elections in Ghana. In summary, it demarcates constituencies, sets polling stations, registers voters, educates voters, registers political parties, sets election dates, and conducts elections and declares their results. Obviously, all these functions are important and must be performed well. But for purposes of the dialogue today, I wish to point out and briefly speak to 5 tasks that I consider to be particularly pertinent to the consolidation of electoral democracy. The first task is for the Commission to get the voters' register right. There are many issues related to the making of the voters' register, but the most difficult has to do with voter identification. The essence of voter identification is to establish the true identity of the prospective voter as the person he or she claims to be at the point of registration and at the point of voting. Over the years, the Commission used various means in trying to achieve this, including using party representatives to resolve challenges concerning eligibility for registration. But voter identification continued to be problematic and often gave rise to allegations of voter impersonation, that is, people using the names of other people, living or dead, to vote. Nowadays, biometric technology is used at both points, the point of registration and the point of voting, to ensure that the person who is voting is the same person who registered, thus solving the problem of voter impersonation. Mr. Moderator, I'm confident that with time, more technology will be introduced into the administration of our elections, and rightly so, because generally, technology has proved to be of great assistance in election administration. For example, it has been used to manage large-scale data, to compile and transmit election results quickly, to provide stakeholders with copies of data, and to make information available to interested persons on a website. In introducing technology into election administration in the past, the Electoral Commission was guided by the paradoxical dictum of making haste slowly. The reason is that the context, setting, or environment into which one introduces technology is important, particularly in respect of voting, the counting of votes, and the compilation and transmission of election results. The processes associated with the technology must be easy to understand and use, must be secure and sustainable, must contain sufficient safeguards to ensure transparency, fairness, and accuracy. In addition, the outputs of the technology must be auditable. In a nutshell, in making haste slowly, the Electoral Commission was of the view that any technology introduced into election administration needs to be user-friendly and secure. And if one cannot build a firewall around what the technology is intended to achieve, it is prudent not to introduce it. The second task is for the Electoral Commission to establish a robust electoral system. Mr. Moderator, an electoral system is robust in the extent to which it can prevent cheating by politicians and voters, as well as deliberate wrongdoing by election officials. In my view, the EC has gone a long way towards creating a transparent electoral system with inbuilt integrity such that it is virtually impossible to cheat without detection. Let me briefly describe the characteristics of the system in 4 steps. One, political parties are given representation at every key point in the electoral process, including voter registration, ballot printing, transportation of sensitive materials, and voting. Two, the overall outcomes of the system are verifiable. That is to say, we can ascertain the authenticity of the outputs of the various processes, and we can trace any misdeed to the point where it occurred. Three, there is always an audit trail of election materials as they are moved from the head office through the regions to the districts and to the polling stations. And four, during elections, there are clear guidelines as to valid and invalid votes. The counting of votes is done at every polling station in the presence of the agents of the candidates. The results are certified by the presiding officer as well as the agents of the candidates, each of whom gets a copy of the certified results. And then the results are publicly declared at the polling station. So, moderator, in a meaningful sense, that is the end of the election. Because from then on, what happens is simply adding up the votes obtained by each candidate in all the polling stations in the respective constituency. Any mistake or wrongdoing committed in the vote collation process are detectable and correctable. That is why the Commission has said time and again that under our electoral system, elections are won or lost at the polling stations and not in the Commission's offices. And I think the political parties now believe it, judging from the way they are trying to organize themselves at the polling station level. Again, it is possible for a well-organized party to know from the polling station results of the agents how it is faring not long after the close of the poll. However, the incipient practice of political parties announcing winners ahead of the returning officer is to be discouraged to avoid unnecessary tension and possible chaos. The third task for the Electoral Commission is to educate the people well. In this effort, the Electoral Commission distinguishes between voter education and electoral education. Every voter needs voter education, every voter. So the content is the same for all. On the other hand, electoral education seeks to give specific groups like the police, party agents, journalists, and judges the knowledge they require for effective participation in the electoral process. So the content varies. Generally, voter and electoral education are seen as tools for building confidence and trust. The cardinal problem about educating the people is that resources are not provided to prosecute it on a continuous basis. So it has become a seasonal activity, thereby making it less effective. The fourth task for the Commission is to protect the interests of both the voter and the candidate. As a moderator, we may define the democratic election simply as a contest among candidates whose outcome is decided by the votes of the people. Clearly, this means that there can be no election without voters or candidates. This close relationship between voters and candidates means that the Electoral Commission has a responsibility to be equally fair to voters and candidates, whether they are sponsored by political parties or not. In terms of fairness to voters, the Electoral Commission has three key responsibilities. One, to facilitate and not to obstruct the right to register as a voter by certain requirements that are difficult for the ordinary person to satisfy. Two, once so registered, to facilitate and not to obstruct the realization of the right to vote. And three, the voter's ballot must be counted as cast. Fairness to candidates is achieved by laying out a transparent electoral framework whose outcomes are verifiable, by involving the representatives of the candidates in the key electoral activities, and by an accurate count of the votes obtained by the candidate. As a corollary to the Commission's responsibility to be fair to them, voters and candidates are also expected to exhibit good electoral behavior. At minimum, each voter should cast only one vote at an election and must allow other voters freely to do the same. And every candidate has an obligation to do clean campaigning. The first task for the Commission is to build partnerships with relevant stakeholders. As I said earlier on, it cannot consolidate electoral democracy all by itself. So what I have said so far may be regarded as the internal environment of the Electoral Commission. So, moderator, I wish now to turn to the contributions that other institutions and organizations could make towards institutionalizing electoral democracy. It has rightly been said that no matter how well an electoral commission does its work, unless the external environment is right, conducting free and fair elections might be like dipping a piece of white cloth in murky water and hoping that it would not be stained. So, moderator, I'd like to begin with the Inter-Party Advisory Committee, which for me represents the most durable partnership so far built. The Inter-Party Advisory Committee, or IPAC for short, is not a statutory body. It was set up in 1994 by the Electoral Commission to, so that it could have regular interactions with the political parties. The decisions are not supposed to be binding, but in practice, every time we have reached decisions, if they are practicable, cost-effective, and in accordance with law, they have been adopted. As a result, several changes to the electoral system have been made on the basis of discussions at the IPAC. The Commission has tried to build partnerships with other relevant stakeholders, like the police, civil society organizations, and the judiciary, and the media. And even though I have only a few minutes, I would like to speak to the partnership with the media. In my view, of all the partnerships that the Electoral Commission has tried to build in support of electoral democracy, that with the media has been the most disappointing. In spite of the efforts of the Media Commission and the Ghana Journalists Association, with a few exceptions, the quality of electoral reporting and political discourse generally remains poor indeed. Perhaps this is not surprising in a landscape littered with partisan political and media establishments. But what this means is that genuine media has not taken deep roots in Ghana. Thus, by and large, the media has so far missed the opportunity to be a public educator and a guardian of democracy. And I dare say that this undesirable state of affairs is likely to be accentuated in the social media. Well, I'm happy that I have only 3 minutes, because as a past member of the Electoral Commission, I feel very reluctant to do an appraisal of his performance over the years. That should be done by the other people. Yes. But let me say that I hope I have not created the impression that everything is okay with our electoral environment. There are several aspects of our electoral environment and practice that require serious attention. Let me indicate some of them in summary fashion. The playing field for our political parties is far from level, due mainly to two factors: the long-standing abuse of incumbency and the lack of some form of public funding for political parties. Election campaigns have not been clean. They have not been devoid of insults, character assassination, intimidation, and violence. For a long time now, efforts to make it possible for Ghanaians abroad to vote in our elections have not materialized. Contrary to law, political party sponsorship of candidates at the district level elections is an open secret. A way to address this might be to open the election to political party competition on a proportional representation basis. We must also take note of some factors that could affect the temperature of our elections. I think ways must be found to restrict the role of money in elections. It is now common knowledge all over the world that unbridled use of money in elections makes it possible for money bags, irrespective of the sources of their money, to hijack the electoral process to the detriment of genuine electoral competition. Again, it is becoming the norm for our politicians to make many promises in their election campaigns. As we know, promises can easily become millstones around a politician's neck. Finally, the rise of vigilantism in the political landscape is not a healthy development for the conduct of free and fair elections, nor for the politicians themselves. Maintaining peace and order and protecting citizens is the work of the police. Now, the coordinator, let me conclude by saying that there is much more to democratic governance than electoral democracy. The fact that the Electoral Commission has been able to deliver democratic elections over a considerable period of time is not to be taken to mean that democratic governance has arrived. However, there can be no doubt at all that a democratic election is critical to democratic governance because it is the only legitimate door to democratic leadership. Thank you.